so 57, so just before the hour comes up. Okay, go and get a coffee or tea and sort of stretch your legs. And okay, we've got the recording back. I think most people are tripping back in again, which is great. Caroline has commented here that she agrees with Claire that the Queensland legislation site is a lot easier than the Victorian site, which has the Victorian Statute Book and Victorian Law Today, both of which are a bit confusing. Thank you for that comment, Caroline. So there are differences in the way that things are presented, as you will find. So feel free to sort of continue that sort of discussion on the Facebook site as well, and sort of review, take that as an activity you could do. Dip into all of the different states and territories and look at which are good from your perspective, which you enjoy using, which you think you might like some guidance. Maybe if you know somebody in another state, they might have some like tips and tricks as to how to work through some of those different legislation sites as well. So use it as a real opportunity to dig deeper and find out more. So Shirin, if you're around and ready, it would be great if you could sort of take over and from the real practitioner side of doing this stuff every day, take people through some of the ideas that you'd like to share as well.
Thank you, Jill. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that all right, Jill?
That's all good.
Oh,
yes,
beautiful.
Yes, you're very clear. That's all good. Thank you.
Yeah,
okay.
It's actually interesting that Caroline mentions the Victorian site. I had this very similar conversation last week with a colleague. She's a law librarian from Victoria, and she has the opposite view. So she was saying how easy the Victorian site is and how she struggled when she started using the Queensland site.
It's probably what you're used to as well, that comes in.
Yeah, I wonder.
So definitely the opportunity to become really familiar, so it's just intuitive that you know where to go and find things. But I won't interrupt anymore.
One sheet that I've used with the Victorian site is I just Google Victorian Bill or Victoria Act, and it takes me to the part of the site. So I have to admit I haven't had the time to familiarize myself with it as much as I'd like to. Jill's asked me to cover some things from a practitioner perspective in relation to legislation. And I looked at the weekly exercises, so I'm coming at it from that perspective, so some of the things we're trying to draw out of the weekly exercises, and examining some of the legal online tools and aspects of those tools that we'll need to be familiar with to go through the exercises, if that makes sense. Following on from the theme of the lecture, so the journey of an act, we wanted to look at maybe 4 aspects of that, 4 stages, and the many stages that Jill talked us through at the beginning of tonight. And those 4 stages are the inception of the act, the bill, those debates around the bill and that sort of formation of that act, and then once that act comes into place, the commencement of the act and the further amendments. So from a researcher's perspective, these are sort of 4 key areas that we need to be very comfortable with because these sort of relate to a lot of the questions that we get as law librarians. So giving you an example, let's see, an example of looking at the debates around the act, or around the bill, I should say. A lot of judges and lawyers are wanting to have a look at those debates that are happening in Parliament to better understand what is intended by the act, So looking at some of the called Hansard, some of those debates, the explanatory notes that Jill mentioned, earlier on tonight, those are really important in legal research to understanding the meaning of an act. And commencement dates are very important as well. So when did a particular section of an act commence may be relevant to when, when for example, a crime took place, which version of the act was relevant and which provision would have been relevant at the time. So we thought we'd just take you through some of those aspects of the life of an act and what tools you would use from a Commonwealth perspective, because that relates to all of us, I think. And Jill sort of gone in more detail to the state legislation, the Queensland legislation, so we thought we'd take it from both aspects. Okay, so bills. Bills, I guess there's sort of three main places that you'll find bills online, and all of them are free. Commonwealth, I should say, from a Commonwealth perspective. So the first, very excited to discover the pointer earlier tonight. The first is Austlii. So some of you would have come across Austlii already. For those of you who haven't, do take the time to have a look at it. It's a fabulous resource for legal research. It's completely free. Austlii stands for the Australian Legal Information Institute. And there's such institutes all around the world. So there's worldly, there's different countries, New Zealand, UK, a lot of countries have their own leads. So for Australia, that's Austlii. Great thing about Austlii is that it has bills, acts, case law, so all those primary sort of resources, but it also has a lot of secondary resources. In our last class, we talked about secondary resources such as journal articles, textbooks, law reform commission reports, things like that. So Austlii sort of pulls a lot of those together, and you can search across those. And it's a great place to do subject searching. The downside of Austlii is that it's not as authoritative as a government site. It's put together by law schools and other collaborators. So it's not necessarily the most up-to-date or official website. For official versions of bills and legislation, there are two places that you might want to look at from a Commonwealth perspective. So that's the Parliament of Australia, and Jill mentioned earlier tonight the Federal Register of Legislation, which people still call Common Law. It changed not too long ago, earlier this year, to the Federal Register of Legislation, previously Common Law, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But first, the Parliament of Australia website, it's a very big site from a researcher's perspective, and so similar to the Victorian legislation websites, I find Googling through it a better way to use it. So I would Google Parliament Australia bills to find that part, because it is quite hard to navigate once you're in. It's quite a big site, but a fabulous one once you get to the bills section, and we'll look at that in more detail in a second. So the Federal Register of Legislation, so that's created by the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, who draft and publish all the legislation. So that's another authoritative source and up-to-date source. And they, I went to a talk earlier this year. When they made the changes, they gave a series of, sort of talks, and they're looking for feedback about it. So it's structured very much like Common Law. If ever you've used Common Law, I don't know. But they're looking to change it more. So it'll probably not look like this for much longer. In the next 2 years is their time frame for restructuring the site. So they brought all the Common Law across, made it blue and prettier, but in terms of the site architecture, they didn't make many changes, and they're wanting to make more changes to that. And there's actually a feedback function which they're monitoring closely. So if you do have feedback as you're starting to explore it from if you haven't used it before from fresh eyes, I think they would really value any feedback that you have. And so obviously one of the tiles on the front page gives you bills as introduced. And that would be my first port of call from looking for bills. So moving to the next slide. So like an act, I guess bills have found an animal protection bill. So bills will either amend, as Jill mentioned, will amend an act, an existing act, or they'll create a new act. And so generally the first page looks like this. So it'll give you the information as to where the bill was presented and read, the name of the bill and what order it came into Parliament, who introduced it, which is often of interest, particularly a searching Hansard, and its purpose. So that'll be the cover page. It'll often either look like if it's an amending act, or amending bill, sorry, it'll often have the provisions of the previous act and the sections that it'll amend. So it's almost like a patchwork quilt. It'll have section 1 amended to section 1 point, or 1 sub A and 1 sub B. So it'll go through bit by bit of the previous acts that it's amending and how it's being amended. So it doesn't read very smoothly, but it gives you the information that you need. And a bill that's introducing a totally new act actually just looks like the act would look. So it goes through the bits of the act and reads as an act would, but shouldn't be confused with the act for this reason. And this is another screenshot of a bill. So it'll give you the title, a short title, which is how it's often referred to in the parliamentary debates. So it's good to know what that short title is. Commencement dates, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail later, and details of those amendments as well. So as I said, this is an amending act, so it sort of has just the parts of the Criminal Code Act that it would amend and in what ways it would amend those. Is that clear? Has anyone had a chance to look at a bill yet? I do recommend it if you do have the time, just to, and when I was a law student, previous to being a librarian, I worked as a lawyer, and we were encouraged by our lecturers to look at legislation, look at bills, and understand the structure, as Jill mentioned. Often when you're doing legal research, you need to find bits very quickly. So having that familiarity is one of those key skills of legal research. So I wanted to give anyone a chance. Feel free just to drop something into the chat box. I am keeping an eye on that. So if you do have any questions, I'll get to them as quickly as I can. So then moving on to the debates about the bill. So as I mentioned before, the decision maker, the judge, is wanting to understand a piece of legislation and how to interpret it. In trying to interpret it, they're wanting to look at the bill, and they're also wanting to look at the discussion around the bill. And this is often referred to as extrinsic materials. You often hear that phrase. And this is a screenshot from the Parliament of Australia website. And so the explanatory memorandum, or explanatory note as it's known in Queensland, you would have seen in Jill's lecture, is often co-located with the bill. So a lawyer may come to you in your law library and say, I need the EM, or the explanatory memorandum, or the explanatory note. Any one of those terms may be used. You first need to find the bill and then find the explanatory note or explanatory memorandum that relates to that. And that's the case in the Federal Register legislation website, as well as parliamentary website. And I think it's great the way that they pull it all together. Here's another example of the range of things that you'll find pulled together around a particular bill. So you'll find when it was first introduced, when it was read for a second time and moved, and second reading speeches really do have the crux of the debate. So that's often what you are asked for to find, and amendments and so forth. And I thought it might be interesting to look at what's in an explanatory memorandum. So it'll really give you like an overview of the bill. It'll give you what's the rationale of the introducing party. It'll give you sort of how it impacts on different laws, and all sorts of things. So it's often quite an interesting read if you have the time. And then, so that all of this is sort of helps the judge decide and helps the lawyer build their case around the act. And then this is other extrinsic materials. I thought it'd be interesting just to have a couple screenshots. So there's the parliamentary debate. There's also committee reports and submissions by the Law Reform Committee. So that's an example of a submission on a particular bill that was introduced, and often as you read through the Hansard, it will refer to a particular report or submission, and so knowing where to find these is quite relevant in interpreting the debate around the bill. So these are some of the things that we wanted to introduce you to.
If you've got any questions, just pop them into the text box.
Questions on that? Makes sense?
You're all able to follow it and understand where Shirin's taking you with all of this, hopefully. You're doing well, Shirin. Keep on going.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, it's really a matter of doing it, and the weekly exercises really helps that. And building that familiarity comes with time and practice. But these are just some of the things that you may start to look at this week in answering the question. Okay. So, commencement of an act. So, the bill's been introduced, it's been debated, now it's about to commence. Commencement information is important from the practitioner's perspective. So when is it in effect? Which version of an act may apply at a particular time, and even within each version of the act, different provisions will start, or schedules will start at different times. So understanding how to find a commencement date is a frequently asked question and an important key legal research skill. Usually in the bill or the act itself, it'll talk to you, it'll mention the commencement information, and so that's usually your starting point. If you're asked, when did something commence or when will it commence, either looking at the bill or the act. And I thought this is a good example of commencement information. So this is within the body of an act. So it tells you that sections 1 and 2 commence on the day on which this act receives royal assent. However, subject to subsection 3, the remaining provisions of the act commence on the day or days to be fixed by proclamation. And if there's no proclamation, then within 9 months of receiving royal assent. So this is a common thing that you'll come across, and so detangling this is important. So where do you find this information in the website? So assent is usually published in the website itself. So if it's an act that's already passed, date of assent will be for this Native Title Act, 24th of December, 1993. So that was the first version of that act. date of commencement with that. Subsequently, this is an act that has been amended many, many times, so then you'll need to understand when the amendments came into place and when did the amending act commence. I hope that's clear. And then, so that's date of assent. Sometimes the legislation will tell you in the body what date it will commence. The third place you'll find that information is by proclamation, and that is published in the Gazette. So the Gazettes are found in online copy. They'll be found on the Federal Register of Legislation in a different part, and the print ones are available in court libraries. We have print ones of older than the 1990s, and other libraries may have them. But they can be a little bit hard to search. So you do need to have a little bit of information about the Act, the dates, other dates around the Act, and then you have to manually go through often the Gazettes to locate the proclamation date. And so this is just a sample proclamation date of the Snowy Mountains Engineering Corporation Limited Sale Act of 1993. And then that will give you a very clear date of commencement for that, for a particular section of that Act. So that's the different ways of finding commencement dates. So just to summarize, in the Act itself, on the website, or Gazette. So moving on, this isn't going too fast. I'm just assuming, unless I hear otherwise, that it's okay. Do feel free once you start going through the exercises to shoot out some questions. In a way, these things can be very straightforward, but very key aspects of foundational skills of legal research into legislation. So moving along in the life cycle of the Act, from commencement, the other key aspect is understanding amendments. So every Act which has amendments to it, I should say, has at the end of it endnotes, or I think they're also referred to as annotations, or table of acts as it is here. So this is a sample from the Parliament Act of 1974, and it shows that it's been amended a couple of times. And so, oh no, just once. So this is the amending act, and this is the year that it amended the Parliamentary Act of 1988, the date that that amendment came into effect, the date of assent, date of commencement. So royal assent for subsections 1 to 4 and 7, and then subsequently section 11 is the date of proclamation, or date of royal assent, is published in the Gazette, and the remaining sections are also published in the Gazette as to dates of commencement. So it's amendments can be a little bit tricky, and so this will give you a little bit of information about which sections are added, inserted, amended, repealed, or repealed and substituted. And hopefully the exercises will draw that out a little bit, and also this is covered by assignment 2, which is coming up next. So hopefully there'll be a chance to really test our skills in understanding interpreting legislation and particular amendments to legislation. One of the wonderful things about the Federal Register, the new common law, it's hard to call it anything else, is that it will give you a series of an act. So this is just a sample of the Patents Act. So the Patents Act, this is the current version, which was registered 21 July 2016, and that incorporated amendments from the Statute Law Revision Act of 2016. So, oh, my little pointer's frozen, hopefully it's okay. And then it will give you previous versions, superseded as they're referred to, of the Act. So if you're doing historical research and you're looking for amendments or a version of the Act prior to, this only goes back a little ways, but prior to 2000, you can go back to a superseded version of the Act as at that time, and within that date range, find out how it was amended and which Act amended it.
That's it. That's okay. No, that's right. No, you go on.
And oh, that's just fine. Yeah. So that was some of the. Oh, sorry. No, I was just recapping. So those were some of the key things that we wanted to draw out from the exercises this week. Hopefully that made sense, and the exercises will further reinforce these skills and interpreting bills, finding extrinsic material relating to those bills, and noting them up.
Thank you, Sharon. That was really a good walkthrough the different aspects that you need to be aware of in terms of working with legislation. It's really over to you. If you've got quite complex queries, I'm quite happy to give you the microphone so that you can talk through the question. We do want you to understand if you are having problems, maybe this is such a, I suppose, technical session, you might want to revisit the recording and look at some of the primary materials, the actual pieces of legislation, or the websites to have a bit more of a look. We're here for you, so please, every time you have a question, pop it onto the Facebook page. Other students, participants may be able to answer it, or we're there as well. But it is a very, very important aspect of legal research to be able to work through all of these things. We also know that a few people have got good experience in these areas, so you might like to put some comments in of what you've had to work through as well. Sarah's picked up the microphone, I think.
Hello, Gillian. When Sharon was talking, I don't work in the law area. She said that the Parliament of Australia site was a little bit hard to navigate, and then she said that she can sometimes go into Google. Does she mean she does like use the Google search engine to then go back into to then find the legislation in the Parliament of Australia, like the bills or the extrinsic material that way? Is that what she meant?
Yes, Sharon, back to you for that one.
Yes, that's exactly what I meant, Sarah. Sorry, it is a bit of a cheat, but so what I'll do is I'll type Parliament Australia and bills rather than going through the parliamentary website itself. Yeah, it's my own cheat. I mean, others may be better at searching through websites than me.
Yeah, I actually use that strategy quite often with Google. Do you know if you type site : and then the basics of the URL, you can limit any search for whatever concept or idea you're looking for to a particular site. And QUT, dare I say, has slightly improved, but in the old days, like a year or so ago, to find anything on the QUT site, I would just put my search terms in and then say site : qut.edu.au, and that limits your search to that actual site. So if you know the site that you're looking for, you can be very, very specific and ignore the whole of the rest of the internet and just look directly into that one area. So it's a really useful strategy to have up your sleeve.
Thank you. That's good.
There's a bit of typing. I think microphones must be free, so you can. No, it's really good. It is, yeah, very, very helpful. It's probably the best thing a librarian should know is to how to ignore the internet and just go into a site. Other bits and pieces you've got? Things that are worrying you? There's a lot to take in. I mean, we realise that there's a group of you out there, you know, some of you are working in this area. Okay, Maria's come up with a question there. Very basic. No, nothing's too basic at all. What are reprints for? Okay. From my perspective, and Sharon might have something else, but basically because, as sort of I introduced at the very beginning, a lot of legislation is actually about amending previous legislation. So you've got an act, okay, so it's a brand new act, and it comes into force. And then, of course, life changes, things happen, and maybe the law doesn't quite work the way that they thought it would work, so therefore they've got to fine-tune it a little bit. And so amendments come in, and they come in as amendment acts. So if you do go back a generation before digital documents, it was very, very hard to sort of patchwork, as Sharon said, you patchwork bits together to come up with some sort of complex piece of documentation that was really quite hard to follow. Because we're in a digital text environment, as amendments are made to specific clauses of the legislation, or sections of the legislation, clauses of the bill, sections of the legislation, you can replace the old text with the new text. So therefore you've now got a new document, exactly like doing track changes, and you morph all the new changes into the document that you're working with. Therefore, the new final, inverted commas, document that you produce is the Act as it is in force at this present time, before any other amendments start coming into play. So that then becomes a reprint. So you've had the Act, you have an amending Act, which is an Act in itself, but then you bring the two together and it produces this new Act, it's like reprint of the legislation as it is in force at the moment. Sharon, do you want to complement that in some way?
I mean, that's perfect. I guess using my fancy pointer, you could say that each one of these would be a reprint of the same Act, incorporating these amendments. And I think they're called reprints for historical reasons, because they would actually print, pre-digital age, they would actually print a new one. So for Queensland, there were these blue acts that, or these blue covered acts that were very thick, and they would be stapled, and you'd have to buy the latest reprint from GoPrint and take that to court. Now, fortunately, we can just go straight to the official website and print off the latest version. But having the latest version is very important, or knowing which reprint, if you're doing historical research, is also important.
And so that's why those previous reprints, as we saw with the Banana Protection Act or whatever, and that just had sort of different versions of the same first reprint. You might get reprint 02, etc., etc. But basically, the query where we've talked about you have to go back to a certain point in time, you do need to know the history of the legislation, and that's what the screen that is in front of you at the moment with the amendment gives you start date, end date. If you're coming in with some issue that is pertaining to, you know, whatever it might be, a certain date in time, you need to know those date ranges. So legislation is dynamic. That's the important thing to realise. Just because there's an act does not mean that the way it came out of Parliament, whatever time it was, is the way that it is relevant today. So it's understanding that dynamic aspect of the way that legislation evolves is the important part. And importantly, can I just add to that, so like the amending acts, if you remember early on, I sort of said it might be a straight amending act, or it might be a quite complex amending act that amends multiple pieces of legislation. The title of the amending act may have nothing to do with the title of the original act that you're looking at. So you can't just follow the titles of the acts and say, oh, well, that's obviously relevant. Occasionally, sometimes, yes, it is. But on other times, it's like, like multiple acts are amended within a single amendment act. It's muddy out there. Did that help answer your question or just confuse you furthermore? Poor Maria. She's typing, I think it meant. Clear on reports. Good for you! But yeah, you do, yeah, as I say, that's probably the best way I can express it, is that they're dynamic. Your legal research has a different dynamic. So it's a bit like going into constellation and trying to find your way into a certain point in time with a certain spaceship or something like that. Sometimes it's really simple and very straightforward, but other times, yeah, as long as you understand the layers and the complexity, that's the good part. And that's what's the enjoyable part of it as well, because it's usually not a simple thing. So, but just to build on that, if you just look at the on Sharon's screen there, the final column on the right, you can see the amending acts have quite different titles. Some are, this is the Patents Act, okay? So the bottom three are Intellectual Property Laws Amendment Act. So yes, you know, you can actually think, yeah, conceptually you're in the right space. Patents, intellectual property, yeah, they belong in the same space. But then the ones above, Acts and Instruments Framework Reform Consequential Provisions Act 2015, is like, yeah, seriously? You know, that's really quite a complex title in itself. And then Statute Law Revision Act number 1 of 2016. Number 1, and that's another thing to notice, that you might have multiple or several acts that do have an extra number put in. So it might be Statute Law Revision Act number 1. That implies there might be a number 2, number 3, number 4. So you sort of need to get your head around all of that as well. So, but that's the fun. That's a good part. Any other queries at this point?
If I could say, in this week's activity, at the very end, I don't know if it's a bit hidden, but I've put down a little terminology cover sheet. So some of the terminology around acts, so what's a principal act, what's an amending act, what's a reprint or a consolidating act, just as a little guide if it is new terminology for students. And if anybody has any other terminology questions, we can add it to the list that they want to know about.
Yeah. So yes, as Sharon sort of showed earlier as well, it really is a journey. So understanding how the sort of flow of change happens across the legislative process is a good way, and the terminology that she's provided starts helping with some of those aspects, I think. So yeah, there's plenty of aspects that you can consider. But please, it's about your understanding. We know we've dropped you in the deep end. It was all pretty easy up to, that's why I gave a break before. So please think critically. Think about what you do understand automatically, where you might have some problems and you're not quite so sure, we're here for you. Just start asking the questions. The exercises are there to guide you. Obviously, we can talk off the top of our heads, and it is very hard in an online environment. We appreciate that compared to doing it in a face-to-face and being all in the same room. So really make the most of the opportunities to ask what is concerning you so that you do understand. And if you're having problems, the exercises are really not there to test you. That is not the point. It is to help you explore, to help you work out what you don't quite understand properly yet and where you'd like some guidance. So they're there really as an informative structure to build your learning and your understanding. So please see them that way. And just ask as many questions as you have, because that's the way you will learn. So on that note, next week, it's a delegated legislation, not the most exciting topic in the book, but we need to look at it so that you do understand where regulations and orders and things like that fit in to the whole game. But we'll start off with Larissa from New South Wales Law Courts Library. I think if you remember in the panel discussion at the beginning, she sort of highlighted that some of the exciting bits was a really long journey back into time, and she's going to provide a few case studies for us around some of the work that she does and the way she approaches it. So it'll give you a different dimension again to the work that is undertaken in terms of legal research. So, and I haven't added it onto that slide, but there will be as well the debrief to the exercises. So please try to find time in the next 7 days to work through at least some of those activities. You don't have to do them all, just pick the ones that are of interest to you. And that will probably give us a pretty random sample across the board in terms of what people have covered, and then make sure that as you're doing it, make a note of every question that you've got. Every time you think, how should I go about that? Make a note, because as we mentioned earlier at the very beginning, there's not just necessarily a single way to do things. There might be multiple pathways, and different people do things in different ways. And so there are so many different resources out there as well. So let's share and build on the different activities that you can find ways to do things that will best suit you and the situation that you're in at that time. So, any more questions, queries or comments? Doing very well, I think. So, as I say, the interview reports that have come through are really insightful. They're great. I'm looking forward to the next batch as well. And all of this that we're going through at the moment is really trying to scaffold, build your understanding to be able to work through the real, inverted commas, assignment bits, the accessible items, which again help you sort of develop your understanding. There's no perfect answer to the way you do things, but obviously in terms of legal precedent, there is also always going to be the right answer at the very end. So anyway, you got an early mark. We're still 20 minutes out, so that gives you 20 minutes to immediately jump in and look at the different resources that we've got for you and the activities, and then you look at your diaries and you work out when you're going to do some of these things to be ready for us next week. Okay, so thank you everybody, and we look forward to catching up with you again next week. Thanks Shireen for everything, and we'll see you around.